Welcome to our JAMS author interview series, where we give you a peek inside the research that gets published in the Journal of the American Musicological Society. Today, I am speaking with Dr. Fabio Morabito, who is an associate professor of musicology at the University of Alberta. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So, can you please give us a brief summary of the topic of your article and the argument that you make?
Sure. So if you have ever stepped into a library, you know the drill. You search the catalog for a specific item, and that normally is done through details about the author, who wrote something, who published it, all about the production of that object. And what tends to be discounted in this approach are the many other kind of lived experiences that object has been part of, the traces left by the many who actually handled a book or a music score. And I'm thinking of particularly of processes of handling music before the age of recording, where especially for repertoire, they rely a lot on written forms of music for dissemination and preservation. And I'm a scholar of the early 19th century Europe, so I think a lot about that kind of repertoire, but this is valid also for other places, other environments. And my article asks, what is the current stage of the theoretical debate about those experiences of handling music and literature? And I'm thinking about very kinds of traces, very different kinds of traces, performance indications, dynamics, phrasings, fingerings, penciled into sheet music, or the inscription of a name or a date on the cover of an LP. A vinyl can also be a textual object to an extent. But also, I ask, how do those traces, a name or a date, change the way we study the object? What if we consider also lived experiences of the object and lived experiences the object was part of that didn't leave any traces, and yet happened? How can we study that? So the article proposes a way of viewing and considering these experiences, often less studies because they are less visible, or maybe because they left very fragmentary traces. In a way, I propose a way of rethink our methodological ways of seeing textual object.
That's so neat. So what fascinates you the most about this topic?
Yeah, so I think about there's been there's extremely valuable knowledge out there to study textual objects and music as texts. And some of this has been I have in mind the work of Kate Van Orden, Rebecca Joffrey Schwinden, people who have studied privileges, licensing system, behind the scene of the production of printed music, for example. And that's incredibly valuable to understand also how people handled textual object in the process of making, after, who bought them. And this is all, for me, has been my training ground. But I also was thinking about what about experiences that are less predictable, less predictable coming together of people and textual objects. So past interactions, that perhaps are only partly knowable. And I've been thinking, how can we make sense of those interactions? And so one of the things that fascinates me is the possibility of making visible these not very visible today interactions. And so I give you an example. I talk about a violinist in 1830s Paris, and I've been spending some time in the archive of this violinist, looking at his library of chamber music and studying his annotations, his fingerings, nuances. He was a pedagogue, so I was like, all this wealth of traces really can have a pedagogical import. But then I realized, by looking more at the way he was using these parts and how he made this printed object part of his life, that he wasn't lending out this library. Like, there were only a couple of these chamber music parts where it was clear that he had given them to a student or to someone in his circle. And so eventually I understood that he was actually quite protective about the annotations that he left on this chamber music that is beautifully preserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France today. So suddenly I was fascinated by the fact I'm here to study the annotation that this guy didn't want people really to find. And compare, for example, to other performers who, in the same period and in the same sort of like tradition of music making, were actually publishing their own nuances of performance. So suddenly, I was looking at much more personalized experience around the musical object. I have another archive that I talk about in the article that really fascinates me. This is a collection of LPs that I inherited because my grandmother rented out one room to a German lady during the 1970s. And upon her death, we inherited her belongings. And so there is this collection of LPs that now sits in my home. But some of these LPs that this German woman owned have annotations. So suddenly there's something like memory of a beautiful morning spent together, or a date and a name. And by looking through these LPs, I realized that they were kind of like they told a love story of she meeting the lover of her life and spending time with them. And then eventually this was a love story that ended really badly. She unfortunately took her own life. So I have these records in my home, and when I first saw them, I thought, "Oh, beautiful! I let me have some LPs, printed in, pressed in Germany in the 60s and 70s." But then I saw my own priorities again, and the priorities of this previous owner of the collection that were in a way clashing. So I was fascinated about how can, as a musicologist, how can we musicology have an analytic, a way of studying this that doesn't sort of like erase their experience or mine, but that can both be there. So I started thinking about how can we do descriptions that are not description of one object, but kind of like almost the same object, but in the hands of different people. So I saw kind of like, I was fascinated by the possibility of telling also other colleagues in the field about we can do this differently and have a more flexible approach to textual objects.
So that, I think, brings us to our next question. Can you tell me a little more about how this work extends existing knowledge in musicology or adds to other discussions about music?
Sure. So I think about the discipline of musicology sometimes as a library. And a library is a way of organizing knowledge, and so is the discipline. But a library is also an argument about what's worth keeping and how to find it again. Who should find, something in which way? And so, when I think about this work that I just published in JAMS and the discipline of musicology, I think about the history of the discipline of musicology and how it was important at specific points in the history of musicology to be perceived as a serious scientific endeavor, that for that reason, maybe some of these more personal experience. I think about the German lady who took her own life, or my violinist in the 1830s not lending his parts. Maybe these more private experiences were not seen as serious scientific endeavor, something that you can generalize, because they were very personal, very, also idiosyncratic, if you want, not what other people were doing at the same time. And so I've been thinking about the history of the discipline and how it has sometimes othered this more sensual, personal. I'm thinking about how the love for music has been famously, sometimes seen as pre-critical. In a way, to become musicologists, you have to go beyond the love for music and start studying in a more objective way. It's very 19th century, if you want, Darwinian also way of organizing knowledge. And so I've been thinking about, what comes to mind is also the beautiful piece by Suzanne Cusick that talks about the history of musicology and how women were excluded because that was too sensual. The famous case of Crawford being left out of the first meeting of the New York Musicological Society. And so I see an opportunity in this kind of work that I'm doing to bring back those experiences that have been othered from the more institutional approach, some of the more institutional approach and historical approach in musicology. For example, in that archive of the violinist, there are also traces of Agustin Bayeux-Sauzet, which was one of the daughters of this violinist, that although his father really didn't want to share the music, she had a very different plan about what these nuances of performance had to do for the world and for her own family. She clearly organizes this library in a different way. And I want to recover also these experiences. Sometimes, of course, also the agency of women in the way archives are preserved, the meaning of archive changing, and this pluralization of entanglements in which the textual objects are, for me, are also sort of like, I have a debt to sociological distributed models. I'm thinking about actor network or the ecologies, as Benjamin Pickett calls them, always in flux and shifting. So what I have to offer to musicology in this article is a bit of a non-static approach to our object of study, if our object of study is a text. And music is not even always a text, of course. But that is also something of the baggage of musicology, that there has been a very prominent textualization of music so that you could do very objective, very scientific studies of it. And so this is a way of looking at text, but not in a static and objective ways. I'm thinking of also the brilliant example of Emma Dillon writing an essay that is called Unwriting Medieval Songs. I was inspired by the idea of unwriting some of that textualization of music that is such an important part and very rich part of our baggage and our training as musicologists. But I think that there is some ways in which the text can be seen also in a non-static way, and this is what the article offers.
Fabulous. So, what would you like a student or somebody new to musicology to take away from your article?
So, one of the things that comes to mind is that there are many ways of rethinking what music is or what musicology does. And so, for example, in the field of textual scholarship, which is the broader field in which this article intervenes and is in dialogue with, for example, at the moment, there are a lot of investment in digital technologies, digital edition of music, people studying coding. And that's really important. And, some of the experiences, some of the project that this article comes from are also in collaboration with people that have that kind of skills. But at the same time, I think that there are various ways of rethinking the archive that are not just, you don't have just to learn an entirely new set of skills. So one thing that I would say is like sometimes there are retraining is important and I highly encourage it, but sometimes there are ways of rethinking what we do that are also can be done in-house in a way. And the other thing that I would encourage a student or someone new to musicology to think about through this article is that some of the disciplinary structures and the methodologies, the way music is studied in music studies today are part of our disciplinary histories. They're quite contingent. They are there because some people in the 19th century felt the need to have music studies look in a certain way because there was a moment in which musicology had to come under the university roof and had to look like other disciplines. Those are contingent structures. Sometimes it's hard to recognize how contingent they are, especially if they have been institutionalized and people have been trained in them. So my suggestion is it can be helpful sometimes to rethink the history of those structures so that you can move more freely within them. I remember that during one of the phases of preparation of this article, I shared it with Roger Parker, which is a mentor of mine. And he asked me, Fabio, now this is all well and good, but now you need to provide descriptions of these textual objects. And I was like, there is a reason why. Now I know, I'm trying to resist the description, something as simple as describing a score. I was trying to avoid it because I wanted to go around it and find a different way. So a way in which a description is not, the description of a library item or the description at the beginning of a critical edition. I was trying to do something different. And so my suggestion for someone new to this is don't be afraid to go to defy some expectation. There might be a productive thing to do by simply not doing what sometimes our training have told us we ought to do. And and at the very least, be self-aware about it. Ask questions like, why am I even doing this? And is there another way of doing it? And if so, what could I gain by doing it differently? So have fun with it, with these structures.
That is wonderful. Dr. Morabito, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
A pleasure. Have fun reading the article.